Good evening, everyone. How are you? Oh, let's get some more energy here. Good evening, everyone. Okay, not towards me, towards the person next to you. That energy, okay? Let me get started. One, I want to thank you for coming out. I think it's going to be a really great informational, educational session. And I want to just mention, if you would, the most important persons that are in the house, in the room. And so I want to introduce you to the most important person. And that's the person in back of you. That's the person beside you. That's the person in front of you. And the point sometimes is we get focused on thinking that the most important person is the person with the mic, okay? So the fact that you have come out to listen to what we're saying about this most important subject is very, very significant to us, and we appreciate your coming out. My name is Lloyd Williams. I'm proud to serve as the president of the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce. And let me, well, thank you, Marco. This is my man. He felt for me, okay? At the end of last year, the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, by the way, which is this year celebrating its 125th anniversary, 1896 is when it was first formed. So you can imagine what it has seen in New York City and in the upper Manhattan area over that period of time. We came together, we always have a different theme, a different focus for each year. And it was brought to our attention the subject matter of climate change and the disproportionate negative impact on communities of color around the nation and beyond. And so we took that up quite seriously. And we were able to partner with the City College of New York, with Columbia University, with West Harlem Innovation Network, with the NAACP, with National Action Network, a number of groups to say, let's start addressing this. And why do we do that? Because what we understand is the role Harlem plays nationally and internationally. And we understand, as Langston Hughes said many years ago, as goes Harlem, so goes Black America. But when he was speaking about that, he was not talking about persons who were necessarily here who spoke English. They may be speaking French, they may be speaking Spanish, but they come from the diaspora. And so we understand that what happens in Harlem resonates. It has legs, it has wings. And why? Because what you obviously know, Harlem is in the center of the most important county in America. No big hype, okay? Harlem is in the center of the county of Manhattan. And what do I mean by that? Oftentimes we talk, Senator Claire and I speak about it, people talk about I'm going uptown. And we got that. But because Manhattan goes up to 241st Street, when you're at 125th Street, you're virtually in Midtown. And so, but the other part of that is because we have the stock exchange, and we have the financial industry and technology and education, media, all of them centered in Manhattan. What happens in Harlem is oftentimes projected around the world. And so if you go anywhere in this world, and there are persons who understand that there are people of color who live in America, they in high probability have heard of Harlem. And so when we talk about Harlem, we are not talking about Peggy Shepard, who you will be hearing from. We're not talking about some area uptown between 96th Street and 168th Street from river to river. We're talking about a Harlem state of mind. And what do we mean by that? We are talking about recognizing that what we do in Harlem translates to Cicero, Illinois, to Roxbury, Massachusetts, to East St. Louis, to South Side in Chicago, to Watts, LA, to Kingston, Jamaica, to Nigeria, to South Africa, a state of mind. And so we are trying to say, by your coming here today, this evening, is that what we are talking about right now is dramatically important to Flint, Michigan. That's what we're trying to say. And so we're going to have an exchange. We started this on the 22nd of April with our public discourse. The 22nd of April, many of you know, was International Earth Day in the world. And so we started with a conference at Columbia University. And so throughout the course of the next few weeks and to the end of the month, you'll be hearing much about this. And we chose to identify, as we look at what we're doing this year, the iconic, historic album by Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. Now, there are very few of us who can even relate to the fact that that album is 52 years old. 52 years old, and as current today as it was 52 years ago and will be for many decades to come. And so what we have chosen to do during the Harlem Week period is on this Sunday, we will have at U.S. Grant National Memorial Park, and this information material for you to take with you with all of the calendars and everything else. We are kicking off a three-part series related to the What's Going On album. And the first part is on this Sunday at a great day in Harlem, U.S. Grant National Memorial Park from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. We are taking from that iconic album the Ecology song. And the Ecology song you guys know is Mercy, Mercy Me from that album. And then what we're doing is the following weekend, on the 20th of this month, on West 135th Street, between Malcolm X Boulevard and St. Nicholas Avenue, where we have the Alex Trebek Harlem Children's Spelling Bee. And why we have that, by the way, Alex Trebek was an active member of our chamber, and his son serves on our board, Matthew Trebek. And many people don't know that the Trebeks have lived in Harlem for many, many years, okay? So what we're doing on the 20th, we're focusing on children. And so we have the Back to School Children's Fashion Show to let young people know that you do not need to have the Louis Vuittons to go to school. You don't have to have the most expensive Nikes to go to school. How can you get some quality stuff that makes you look great at an affordable price? The Back to School Children's Fashion Show. And then we have an outdoor children's festival with games and rides and robotics and everything on that day. And so from that album, Marvin Gaye, we took the song Save the Children for that day. And then the last way we salute Marvin Gaye is on our biggest day, Harlem Day. And that goes from, it's actually 3/4 of a mile literally, from 5th Avenue to St. Nicholas Avenue on West 135th Street with 3 stages of entertainment, and there's a lot of stuff here. Broadway plays and some of the greatest names in R&B and hip hop and jazz and all of that. What we determined to do on that day is end Harlem Week with the name of the album, What's Going On? And I think all of us should be questioning, and I'm sure you are, because you wouldn't be here right now with your consciousness if you were not concerned about what's going on here. And so that's what we're going to end with. So let me just say this. I appreciate you being here. Hope that you come out for Harlem Week. One thing about it is the price is good, because everything I mentioned is all free, plus massive entertainment and exhibits, etc. I close on this piece, and I really would like you guys to join with us. I would like you to become a chorus on this. On this Saturday, the 13th, we do something called the Percy, Sutton, Harlem 5K Run. Michael Rogers, when he was with the New York Road Runners, was instrumental in us creating that piece. We started the Percy, Sutton, Harlem 5K Run, and we did it around a health initiative, and there were 168 persons, and we couldn't have been happier, okay? Now, this year, already registered is 5,000 people. And if they had not cut off the registration, it would have gone up to 7,000 or 8,000 persons. So that's happening from St. Nicholas Avenue on West 135th Street at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning, the 13th. And this is a great event, but there's something more significant than that. And this is where you have to be the people who are conveying the message. We each year, after the run, we do a health walk. It might be about asthma or sickle cell or whatever the case may be. But this year, and this is where we need your help, it is an anti-gun violence health walk. An anti-gun violence health walk entitled Save Our Children. And so what we're asking you to do is come out. We're asking you to talk to your neighbors, your families, your friends, and say, hey, let's step up. Because what we're seeing in this country is crazy. We all know that. But we're expecting others to be responsible for channeling this in the right way, and that's not going to happen. We have to take the responsibility. So intergenerational, diverse, we want you to come out, and we want you to join us at 9 a.m. on that morning, just to walk together, to meet people together, and to say enough is enough. And so the charge is to you, to take this on seriously, to pass the message, and to make sure that we step up and become responsible for the future, which is why we're here today. Let me then move on with the program. This is funny because, so we received a call today from Fox TV, and they said Arthur Chan could not be with us today. And we were disappointed because we did not just want to have one of our media partners to be with us. When I spoke to Dan and Adrian and shared with them that Arthur Chan would be with us, they perked up. They said he's always been an advocate for issues related to climate change, etc. So it wasn't just a personality. It was someone with a conviction. And so with that in mind, we said, okay, he can't be, fine. And then they said Lisa Evers from Fox would come, and Lisa's our girl. I mean, but she wasn't Arthur, okay? And so we were comfortable with that. And so then I looked up, and I saw Arthur walk in the room, okay? And the funny part about it, Marco, stand up for a moment. Marco Nobles is our vice chairman who takes care of media. Yeah, give him a hand. Okay, takes care of media, etc. So while Marco was here, he gets a call from Fox apologizing profusely that Arthur could not be with us, and Lisa is on her way, okay? And we'll be there in a few minutes. And Marco has said, I'm sitting right next to Arthur. Okay, he's right here. And so without further ado, please give Arthur Chan a big round of applause. Okay.
I'm definitely not here for my personality. I know that much. Thank you very much, Lloyd. I'm slowed. I tore my Achilles, so my mobility is a little bit slower. That was the confusion over this, but I'm generally slow anyway, so it doesn't really affect how my mind works. It is my privilege for this to be my second year involved in Harlem Week. And for that, I thank our station general manager, Lou Leone, who allows us, who not just encourages us, but makes it easy for us to participate in things in the community that we're passionate about. Whether it be for Lisa Evers, a lot of my colleagues, we've spent a lot of the last couple of years reporting on the climate crisis, and unfortunately, for many years before that, on racism, not just in New York City, but in the country. And I would point out we're Fox 5, the local station. I'm not blonde, and amongst other things. But anyways, so when it comes to the climate crisis and racism, they're probably two of the greatest crises that we face in the 21st century. And for some, what we fight against in media is this perception that we're all in it together, which would make sense, because if the globe gets warm and all these things are happening, a lot of times you would think that there's no discretion in terms of who it hits. But over the years, we see in data that there are specific communities that get hit more than others, which is why I'm grateful that there is this discussion taking place today. Some of the nuanced questions actually point to the differences, mainly if we ask ourselves, who caused it? Who shares the greatest responsibility for causing this climate crisis, right? And as part of that question, who profited the most, or who benefited the most while we applied capitalism to allow this to continue, right? And we find that the answer to the first two are different from the third and last question, which is who now pays the price? To that extent, we have seen some things in New York, and I want to just put out there what we have reported on with the hopes of learning more today about how we can do a better job. We have learned in terms of who is hit in this city through data that we've gotten. For instance, the New York Times last summer measured the temperatures of street surfaces in different parts of the city. I don't know how many people here remember that. They measured here in Harlem on First Avenue, and on that day, at that hour, it was 115 degrees. At that same hour, they took the street temperature on Central Park West, on West 84th Street. Actually, it was West 94th Street, and the temperature was 84 degrees. It was 31 degrees cooler at the same time in Central Park West than it was here in Harlem. And Harlem wasn't even the worst in the city. Up in the Mott Haven section on East 130th Street, at that same time, it was 119 degrees, right? 84 degrees along Central Park West, 119 degrees in Mott Haven, same sun, same weather, same city, same hour, same day. So that was one thing that got our attention, right? Because it was data. It was no longer this emotional discussion. The other thing that we saw is heat-related deaths in the city. The health department tells us on average there are 350 New Yorkers who die from the heat each year. It's a lot more than the cold. The cold is like over a dozen, right? So it's a major, major problem, and it's probably gonna be higher this year, unfortunately. And what we found was that Black New Yorkers are twice as likely to die as white New Yorkers in that number. Even though Black New Yorkers are outnumbered by white New Yorkers 2-to-1, they outnumbered white people in terms of fatalities when it came to heat deaths. That's also a fact, right? And the other issue which has been documented, that goes way back before we started having this discussion, where asthma rates and upper respiratory illnesses in different parts, in different neighborhoods in the city. And this is my view. It has a lot to do with how it's easy to run infrastructure through certain neighborhoods. If it's Brooklyn Heights and you're going to take away the promenade because of work being done to the BQE, there's a lot of pushback, right? But if you want to build a highway through parts of the Bronx, you build it in front of people's homes, right? There's no discussion about putting it above ground is the first concession that we see in infrastructure. Below ground is the ultimate, which they have in Brooklyn Heights, but they don't have in the Bronx. So we have seen proof of this, unfortunately, through the years, and it will take a combined resource of people who are from the verticals that we have speaking here today in order to solve. And with that, let's begin with the first vertical, and that is government. And so allow me to introduce New York State Senator Cordell Clear to take the next part of this discussion further. Thank you. You walk better than me, I'm jealous.
Thank you for that. It's a lot to follow. Good evening, everybody. Give me that same energy. Come on. This is Harlem. Good evening, and thank you, Lloyd and the Chamber, for addressing this very important topic that we should all be thinking about and talking about, and it's affecting everybody. As I look around the room, I see so many community pioneers and lifelong activists and neighborhood heroes, particularly my dear, dear friend, Peggy Shepard. I thank you. You've been in the fight for decades when nobody was listening, but you made them listen. And you know, there are some people in the room who were dedicated to helping me with a fight against some hazardous conditions that are in our very homes, that are also part of this environmental justice and environmental racism that has been portrayed on this community and other similar communities. But, you know, I know, Peggy, you've been out there keeping transfer stations off our blocks and reducing asthma, engaging in real community development of the so-called Brownsfields projects that have been around. But any progress we have made, any part of Harlem and northern Manhattan that has been saved and preserved, it has been because of you and people like you. And I've been honored to link arms with you in the fight, and now we're in the fight for our collective lives. Environmental issues are near and dear to my heart, as you know. However, as a state senator, I want to tell you that every day our people do worry a lot more about paying rent, buying groceries, securing stable housing, getting a quality education, as well as accessing health care that is free of barriers. When our people are oppressed and disproportionately impacted, it takes continued acts of courage and resolute spirit to fight every single fight from morning to night. It is the immediate needs that translate most, and not everyone thinks about clean air to breathe, pure water to refresh, and an environment safe from weather extremes as immediate needs. However, there is a single current that runs through all of these issues. They are fundamentally related to justice, equity, and reversing centuries of racist, discriminatory impacts and selfish thinking. We can and we must and we will unite around these common ground principles. That is what I see as our mission, one that relates to the fierce urgency of the moment. If on the day we truly get affordable housing for all, the bedrock of Manhattan crumbles from environmental degradation, what good is it? So we really have to fight. Certain times call for more than incremental changes, such as the New Deal and the Great Society. The moment to deal with our environment and climate change in a holistic way is upon us now. Fortunately, in the New York State Legislature, some of us have seen the light, and I'm proud of my first few months in Albany, where we accomplished the following. Budget-wise, we increased the Environmental Bond Act allocation from $3 billion to $4.2 billion. If approved by the voters, this will dedicate $1.1 billion for flood risk reduction, $650 million for open space and land conservation, $1.5 billion for climate change mitigation, including electric school buses and green buildings, and $650 million for water quality improvement. We also made landmark changes to the Freshwater Wetlands Act, expanding the Department of Environmental Conservation's jurisdiction over wetlands and key habitats to 7.4 acres in size. In addition, we enacted an assessment on gas and electric corporations to help fund NYSERDA's research on climate change, as well as fund relevant climate change-related expenses of the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Agriculture and Markets Fuel New York program. We pushed extremely hard to pass the lead-free Kids New York agenda, and I was proud to stand at numerous events with the caucus, We Act, the Just Green Partnership, and so many others to fight for the funding and resources to end the scourge of lead poisoning for the last time. I am proud that a number of bills from those events did pass, including S05A, 805A, my bill that requires the Department of Environmental Conservation and Department of Health to establish new and updated environmental standards for lead in soil, dust, and ambient air. S3079A is a bill I proudly co-sponsored that prohibits insurers from excluding lead-based paint coverage from their policies. 1013C is a bill that I proudly co-sponsored, which requires environmental review of projects under the State Environmental Quality Review Act to include consideration of potential disproportionate or inequitable pollution impacts on disadvantaged communities, and prohibits the issuance of permits or approvals for projects that may cause these impacts. That is particularly important. I'm just going to pause for 1 second, because we talk about, and I listened to Lloyd saying that this song is 52 years old. So this is not a new problem. This has been happening. And what is most racist about it is that it is allowed to occur in communities where people have the smallest political voice. This is why we have all these bus depots in Harlem. We have to really look at why things are placed where they're placed. People like Peggy Shepard, who came out and fought against the waste treatment plant being in Harlem. These are the kinds of issues that we have to look at ahead of time, because we know what the impact is going to be at a later date. And it's not good enough to just stand here and say, look who's been impacted, when we knew this is what it was in the beginning. So we have to have these kind of reviews and respond to them before they have the negative impact that they do in our communities. And furthermore, I was heartened that the Senate passed the following bills that I strongly advocated for, which was requiring the state to convert its fleet of vehicles to zero emissions by 2035, establishing a moratorium on converting decommissioned fossil fuel burning plants into crypto mining facilities, prohibiting the use of PFAS in apparel, the Advanced Building Codes Appliance and Equipment Efficiency Standards Act, the Build Public Renewables Act, which would mandate the development of publicly owned renewable energy generation to help meet the state's CLCPA goals. In all, 2022 was a year of progress, but every year we must build upon our progress. And there is so much for us to work on together, such as the implementation of the CLCPA, passing the All-Electric Buildings Act, going carbon-free, passing the Birds and Bees Act, and much, much more, and building on the cruelty-free cosmetics law to ensure all personal care products are 100% safe, and ending lead poisoning once and for all. I hope everyone here tonight will lead the way. Organizations, local businesses, community cornerstones, you can all lead the way. Our religious institutions, you can all lead the way. We all have a part to play. Each and every one of you, each and every one of your groups and organizations will be needed to save this planet. And what we do tonight matters. The fight continues. Thank you.
The senator brought up lead poisoning, which is interesting to us too, because certain communities in New York City get hit harder right? And that, if I'm correct, unless it's been corrected, New York City's threshold for what's considered lead contamination in young people, it's a lot higher, that threshold, than nationally. So our numbers may look low, but if we use the national standard, it's actually a larger problem here than we would know. And just so we know that this is a racism and poverty issue, Southeast Asian New Yorkers, particularly from Bangladesh and Pakistan, have some of the highest levels of lead poisoning in New York City, as well as pregnant women from those communities, something like 90%. It's ridiculous. Anyways, with that, since we've covered the governmental arm of this, it is time to introduce a great community voice in Peggy Shepard, who the senator noted. She is the co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice. Peggy.
So good evening, everyone. Great to see you all today. So we're here for Harlem Week. And you know, some people say that your zip code can define your health, perhaps even predict your life. And here in Harlem, we have a set of zip codes that were home to the illustrious poet Langston Hughes, to visits from Zora Neale Hurston and visits from Fidel Castro over at the Teresa Hotel, and then the incredible celebration with Nelson Mandela on 125th Street. That was an incredible moment here in Harlem. Yet those are the same zip codes that also share the legacy of environmental racism. And why do we call it environmental racism? Well, because communities of color like Harlem have been targeted by business, industry, and even government to bear the disproportionate exposure to polluting facilities and toxic sites. And it really results from a Byzantine legacy of housing segregation, land use and zoning discrimination, and a lack of environmental law enforcement. Now, this brand of racism has resulted in the disproportionate exposure and the cumulative impact of so many environmental hazards and polluting facilities in one community. And it has contributed to health disparities, lowered IQ in some children, and shortened lifespans here in Harlem. Not so long ago, there was research that showed that a man in Harlem lived to the general age of 65, the same age as a man in Bangladesh. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about shortened lifespans and we talk about the environmental contributors to that outcome. So the option at We Act for Environmental Justice has really been to pursue environmental justice by organizing the most impacted people in our community to engage in policymaking. And working within a national environmental justice movement of Black, Asian, and Indigenous peoples, grassroots organizations, we define environmental justice through a civil rights lens on environmental decision-making. So here in Harlem, We Act has raised the concept of environmental justice to the City Council, the Mayor's Office, the state legislature, and the Biden administration, because place matters. And of course it does, because we're all here tonight in celebration of Harlem Week. So we know that place matters. And you know, that's what Chuck Sutton and I thought when we were elected district leaders in West Harlem in 1986. We were confronted with a sewage treatment plant at 138th Street on the Hudson River, the one with the riverbank Denny Farrell State Park on top. And that was being planned during Percy Sutton's borough presidency. And it opened just as Chuck and I started West Harlem Independent Democrats. And some of you may remember Ginny Eason from 626 Riverside Drive. She told Chuck and I that we had to educate and organize the community to stop the pollution from the plant. And that wasn't an easy task to do because Mayor Koch was our mayor and Harlem was not his favorite place. But instead, David Dinkins was a real champion for us. But guess what? We sued the city and David Dinkins, who grew up with my father in Trenton, New Jersey, babysat me when my parents were with him at Howard University. Mayor Dinkins was great on the issue. but we needed a court mandate to ensure the retrofit and future maintenance of the plant when David Dinkins was no longer mayor. And on the last day of the Dinkins administration, we got an unexpected $1.1 million settlement of our lawsuit in the form of a West Harlem Environmental Benefits Fund. But you know, once you see one issue, you look around and you see so much else. So soon we realized that all uptown neighborhoods house 6 out of the 7 diesel bus depots in Manhattan. So Chuck suggested we reach out to Dr. John Ford at Harlem Hospital to see if there were more emergency room visits coming from the zip code of the North River sewage treatment plant. 3 years later, you know, research takes a while, Dr. Ford called us and published one of the first studies that showed that asthma in Harlem was 3 times higher than other New York City neighborhoods. We were stunned, but we were not surprised. So we filed a lawsuit against the MTA, which was planning to build another diesel bus depot at 133rd and 12th Avenue across from a school. We later filed a Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, an administrative complaint against the MTA at the Federal Department of Transportation. Unfortunately, it was under the Bush administration. They believed the MTA when it said, depots have to be uptown because it's a business necessity. So our legal actions did not succeed in stopping the projects or the idling buses, but succeeded in getting the MTA chief of buses to meet with us and our attorney every month for a year. And over the years, 13 to be exact, we hammered the MTA on bus shelter ads saying diesel bus fumes can kill, until we got former Governor Pataki to buy 300 CNG compressed natural gas buses, phase in low sulfur fuel before it was mandated, and eventually transformed every bus in New York City to hybrid and now electric. It was a long, bumpy ride, but it also shows you how what appears to be a small community issue, if you prevail, can in fact change the course of environmental quality for the entire city. So, you know, I realize that we may not have had that success without some key partnerships with academics and law schools. Partnerships and coalition building have been key to our success, since none of us have the resources, the skill, and the community knowledge to create change by ourselves. So we've had a 22-year partnership with the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health on air quality and toxics data as a subcontractor to the community education and outreach core of 2 of those research centers at Columbia. WEAC works to translate that research into public policy that protects human health. So that research and community advocacy has been effective. New laws on lead poisoning, on toxics in children's products, and the new Climate Leadership Community Protection Act that mandates 35 to 40% of state investment in clean energy goes to environmental justice communities like Harlem. But you know, Harlem still has a lot of challenges. Decrepit public and private housing filled with lead and mold. We worked with our member, Michelle, who lives in the Polo Grounds and who had lived with black mold and holes in her ceiling for years as it was painted over and grew back time and time again. Our neighbors in Esplanade Gardens were exposed to a large diesel bus depot in a cul-de-sac in front of their complex with air pollution from the buses and the subway rail yards nearby. So we've worked with them in a community task force for 6 years, meeting monthly with the MTA to rebuild the Mother Clara Hale Depot into a state-of-the-art LEEDs-rated depot. Now that was a success, but lately we've noticed the buses have started parking on the street again, across from a senior center. An important lesson is that monitoring compliance is as important as creating the law or the policy. So today, there should really be no surprise that scientists tell us that the most vulnerable places will be first and worst hit by climate change and extreme weather events. And to that point, Esplanade Garden residents were challenged again, certainly not to the extent of public housing residents in Coney Island, Red Hook, or the Far Rockaways, but as a result of Hurricane Sandy, their parking lot was flooded with major damage to cars and the structure. But they're not the only ones. Many neighborhoods in East Harlem are in a flood zone, including the East River Esplanade, which was damaged by Hurricane Sandy, and many low-lying areas throughout Harlem are flood-prone. However, last year, the mayor did allot $284 million to make repairs along the East Harlem section of the Esplanade, including Pier 107, due to the outcry from local residents and the community board. But you should also know that extreme heat is the deadliest impact of climate change, and multiple studies show that it disproportionately harms people of color. In fact, according to the New York City Department of Health, Black New Yorkers are twice as likely to die from heat-related illnesses as other racial and ethnic groups. That's unacceptable. We understand that. And that's why mitigating extreme heat has been a top priority for us. WE ACT has taken several journalists and elected officials on a heat tour of East Harlem, which the city says is 2 degrees hotter than the city's average, but Fox News is telling us that it's even more significant than that, depending on that particular day. So I've got to use that statistic. That's an incredible one. And, you know, we also understand that there are vast differences, especially in East Harlem, in temperature from block to block, due to paving, due to building materials, lack of trees, and lack of open space. So as a result of the increasing extreme heat days, we've been working at the state and federal levels to increase access to and funding for HEAP, which is the Home Energy Assistance Program. Most people know it for heating, but we want those funds to help people cool their homes in the summer. And earlier this year, we issued a report based on a community-led audit with recommendations to improve the city's cooling centers. But as a result of extreme weather impacts, it's important for every neighborhood to develop its own climate resilience plan. And when WE ACT developed its Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan with 400 Harlem and Washington Heights residents, they prioritized energy security. And I was surprised. I was like, you're prioritizing energy security? And they said, yes. We've got to bring renewable energy to Harlem, which has experienced so many blackouts and brownouts. It used to be that when there was a problem, our communities were the first for the electricity to be turned down, which really hurt so many small businesses, even hurt some laboratories up at Columbia Med Center. So again, we understood that bringing renewable energy to Harlem is clearly so important. So we've partnered with Solar One and UHAB to launch Solar Uptown Now. The acronym is SUN. And so far, that program has installed solar panels on the roofs of 11 HDFC buildings in Uptown Manhattan. By offsetting that electricity needed for the common areas of these buildings, the program has saved residents an estimated $61,000 in the first year and an estimated $1.9 million over the 25-year lifetime of the installations. Also, more than 100 members of the community were trained as certified solar panel installers, opening a pathway for them to really build careers in the emerging green economy. And it's a great story. 12 of our trainees formed a solar worker cooperative called Solar Uptown Now Services. They've incorporated, they've been trained in running a co-op, and they're now bidding on large solar array jobs upstate. So we know that the climate crisis is fueled by greenhouse gas emissions in New York. 71% of these emissions come from buildings that are burning fossil fuels, which leads to nearly 2,000 premature deaths each year across the state. So last year, we helped lead a coalition that passed New York's Local Law 154, which mandates that most new buildings under 7 stories will be required to be all electric beginning in January 2024. And those over 7 stories will begin in July 2027. And so now we're working to advance the All Electric Buildings Act, which is a statewide version of the city law. So as we transition to renewable energy sources, we know that energy security will impact millions more households as utility bills increase. And to decarbonize buildings, a pre-investment is going to be needed in our communities, because We need to upgrade low-revenue residential buildings in frontline communities before electrification of all buildings will be achieved. And we've been doing a pilot project called Out of Gas in the Bronx, where we've been switching out gas stoves, which are highly polluting indoors, and switching in induction electric stoves. And really, we understood that it was so hard to find a landlord who would work with us. And let me tell you, landlords wanted to do this until they did the audit and found out the cost of upgrading the electricity in their building in order to allow for these electric stoves. And so again, that pre-investment is going to be needed in our buildings in order for us to really decarbonize and be part of the solution. So my vision is really to redress the legacy of pollution by targeting frontline communities to become green zones, where we can incentivize and aggregate community shared solar, electrification, energy efficiencies, green businesses, good jobs, and worker cooperatives in targeted communities that have been so disinvested in for so long. But one good news is that we are at an inflection point with an opportunity to achieve that vision. The Biden administration is committed to centering environmental justice in all government policies through an executive order that directs at least 40% of the benefits from federal investments in clean and climate energy to go to disadvantaged communities. So we recently took the MTA and Federal Department of Transit officials on a walking tour of the 125th Street East Harlem Transit Corridor of the Metro North Station and the Lexington Avenue and 2nd Avenue subway lines. After 2 years of community meetings and a report of recommendations, we're working with Congressmember Espaillat and Senator Schumer to bring Justice 40 investments to revitalize the East Harlem Transit Corridor, to bring opportunities to small business, and to highlight the legacy and the culture of El Barrio. So today there's an important opportunity to implement a transformative and accountable process for the fair and the just distribution of the benefits of Justice 40 to frontline communities of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. But we have to make certain that the investments and the benefits reach the communities intended, given the bias and the ambivalence of so many state and local governments around this country. But we know if this is done effectively, that this could be transformative and can stop the cycle of exploitation and degradation, because we know that every community has the right to a clean environment. You don't need to be an environmental or climate justice leader to embrace that as a value. We can create a legacy of environmental quality and climate resilience for all in Harlem and the Harlems of the world. And we can do that together because place matters. Place matters. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If you don't mind, this is a surprise that we're doing, and I'd like to ask if Tony Rogers and Stephanie Francis could come and join me, please. I asked both of them to join. Steph, thank you, to join because they are founding members of Harlem Week. And so, Peggy, if you don't mind, this is something special for you. It is original artwork created by the renowned Ademola Aluj-Bifola. And it says, the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce Harlem Week and Columbia University proudly recognize and salute Peggy Shepard, co-founder and executive director, WEAC for Environmental Justice. And it has the WEAC logo, empowering communities to power change. And we salute her for her pioneering leadership in educating our nation on the significant concerns of climate change. It's presented on this day. But hopefully you'll have opportunity to look at this artwork. because it's original art collage, and it captures the sun, the wind, and the earth. And that we are proud, Tony and Stephanie, if you would just come to the forefront, and Peggy, if you'd go with them so the photographer can get you all, okay? And I'm sure, having listened to Peggy Shepard, you understand why we admire her, love her. You know, you were our environmental angel long before anyone paid attention to it. And we cannot be more proud of you and more thankful. I will say this to you, and I do it without hype. Has anyone ever calculated how many thousands of lives she has changed and saved over the decades? Thousands of lives, not just in New York, but as we say, there's a Harlem state of mind. And Peggy has traveled around the world, around the nation, talking about environmental justice. So thank you so much.
It may be hard to imagine that there's anything that Peggy can't accomplish on her own, but as we have learned that even the greatest of community leaders and organizers need partners to achieve some of the tougher goals out there. And with that, she offered the segue into the academic vertical. And with that, let's introduce Daniel Zarilli, who is the Special Advisor for Climate and Sustainability at Columbia University. He used to do that for the city in some capacity as well, and he'll also introduce our wonderful panelists.
Thank you so much. Let me, I think just in the interest of time, let me start to just bring up the fellow panelists, and then I'll say a few words. I'll be joined on this panel by Dr. Courtney Cogburn, who's an associate professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work, as well as by Adriana Espinoza, the Deputy Commissioner for Equity and Justice at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Why don't you come on up? Emily Maxwell, the New York Division Cities Director with the Nature Conservancy, and the Honorable Milton Tingling, Chairperson and Board of Directors of the West Harlem Development Corporation. Thank you so much for having me, and a round of applause. It is a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here to help with all of the events that are surrounding Harlem Week this year, and it's my privilege to be able to represent the Columbia Climate School in this. This is a second series that we started on Earth Day with the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce under the leadership of Lloyd Williams on the topics of climate and environmental justice. It's just such an important and timely topic that, you know, especially as we're sitting here in August and we just went through a bit of a heat wave, these climate impacts are continuing to come at us. They're continuing to have a disproportionate impact in communities of color all across the country and around the world. And, you know, much will have been said about those impacts and the things that are happening. What I think is really interesting is that there's a continuing change in the policy landscape that is pointing towards solutions. And whether it's the action that the city has taken on Local Law 97 and the Environmental Justice Advisory Board chaired by Peggy Shepard that is continuing to drive environmental justice into the city's decision-making, the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and the commitment to invest at least 35% of investments around climate into disadvantaged communities, and now the federal action, hoping, you know, with the fingers crossed, to be able to finish the Inflation Reduction Act to drive billions of dollars into clean energy and climate resilience, but also to see the Justice 40 initiative drive those dollars to better environmental justice outcomes. And there's a lot to be said, of course, about the Inflation Reduction Act and how it will help and perhaps harm environmental justice that we all need to keep an eye on. But what does it all mean? There's this changing landscape, and we've got a great panel here to talk about, you know, how communities can come together to drive solutions and to change the policies that are impacting our lives on a daily basis. And so with that, and one bit of flexibility that I think we have here, I want to make sure that we have time to hear from Dr. Courtney Cogburn, who may have to maybe have to depart a little early. I'm not sure. I want to turn it over to Courtney just for your reflections first on this conversation and where you see this going and a bit of how we've gotten here as well.
Yeah, thank you. I have my 6-year-old here with me who's only had popcorn for dinner, so we have to go soon. Thank you. It's an honor to be here and a part of Harlem Week. And I am new to the world of environmental justice in terms of a professional undertaking. And so it's really an honor to be involved with the efforts that have been taking place in Harlem for so long. My work has focused on the effects of racism on health, and so that's been talked about a bit here, but producing some of that data that documents the effects of zip code on predicting life mortality, the ways in which even the stress of racism can contribute to heart disease and stroke, diabetes, etc. I also think a lot about how we characterize and measure racism. How do we actually, it's one thing to talk about it, but how do you actually quantify what racism is? And that's one piece from an academic perspective that I think can be beneficial to these efforts, right? We've talked about the significance of data in documenting the effects of things and not only emotion, which is also important. So my work has played a role in producing some of that data. And on the climate side, I work as part of a climate modeling center at Columbia that's focused on using big data science, to try and leverage all the data that we have from different climate ecosystems to better predict more accurately what's going to happen and when, particularly in the 10 to 40 year range. We need a lot of improvement in those efforts. In order to do a good job of that, we have to have strong community partnerships. You can't just pull data from the ether and make sense of it without people who live in that community, who have been a part of that community, helping us to make sense of what that data is, what types of data you need in order to make decisions about where you go next. And so part of my role is building bi-directional knowledge transfer relationships. I very much so afford the idea that the only knowledge that matters is not produced in academic settings. We are not the smartest people in the room. We know some things, we know a little bit, we don't know all the things. And so building those community partnerships is really critical. The last piece I'll forward, and this has been touched on beautifully by our speakers, and I just want to drive home the point that racism is designed. It was done on purpose. When we decide to put bus depots in Harlem and not in other places, when we decide to put trash dumpsters, etc., in Harlem and in particular communities and concentrate them in those spaces, people know the effects of that. They know the effects of bus pollution. They know the effects on asthma, etc., and they still chose this community as a target. I don't want to underestimate the significance of that. It's not just a convenient policy decision that gets made. Racism is designed. It has always been designed. The decision to fill Harlem with concrete and not trees is part of why Harlem is so much hotter than Central Park West. That's a design decision. And because it was designed, and because communities don't just happen to be disadvantaged, it can be undesigned and it can be redesigned. And people like Peggy Shepard and others are giving us a roadmap for exactly what needs to be done. And so I look forward to continuing to build the relationships necessary to maximize our effectiveness at moving the needle, because as we all know, it's existential at this point, and we have a lot of work to do. So I'm sorry if I have to leave before my fellow panelists are finished. I hope you understand, and thank you for having me this evening.
Wonderful, thank you. And I had the pleasure to work with Adriana in the mayor's office before you, of course, moved on to bigger and better things in Albany and bringing great work into state government. I'm really interested to hear. I would love to have you introduce yourself a little bit further to the group and talk about like the work that you're doing to bring equity and environmental justice into state government and how that can impact communities here in the city and in particular Harlem.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. I'm really happy to be here for Harlem Week. I have passed this building many times, but it's my first time being inside, so I'm excited for that. So yeah, I'm Adriana Espinosa. I'm Deputy Commissioner for Equity and Justice at the State Department of Environmental Conservation. I had the pleasure of working with Dan. I also worked with Peggy for many years as an advocate before I switched over into government. But my role now is a pretty broad portfolio for the state of New York. I think you could sort of summarize it to say that I'm leading the climate justice portfolio within the state in my role. It includes overseeing the Office of Environmental Justice within DEC. The Office of Environmental Justice works on a number of items, including grant making to community-based environmental justice organizations across the state. We also work with our permits division on ensuring environmental justice considerations and permit decisions, and something that we call enhanced public participation, making sure that that happens in environmental justice communities across the state. I also oversee our consultation and cultural affairs with Indigenous nations in New York State, and the internal diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work internal for my agency and our personnel. And then finally, and what I'll focus mostly on this evening is the work of the Climate Justice Working Group, which was created out of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I'll call it the Climate Act just because that's very long. And it is a body that was convened to define the term disadvantaged community. It's a loaded term for sure. I didn't choose it. But it is built into the Climate Act as we move to a carbon neutral economy by 2050, economy-wide mandated in this Climate Act. As Peggy mentioned earlier, a minimum of 35% with the goal of 40% of the benefits and investments of that transition must be in what is termed disadvantaged communities. And my job and my team's job is to define and work with the Climate Justice Working Group to finalize what does that mean? Where are those communities? What are the disadvantages? And the Climate Justice Working Group met over the past 1.5 years to develop criteria, which I can get into more a little bit more in the panel, but released a draft criteria for disadvantaged communities. Back in March, we had a 120-day, actually we extended it, so I guess we would say 130-day comment period, and looked at socioeconomic factors, climate vulnerability, exposure to environmental burdens and pollution, and negative public health outcomes, and created an index of all of those 4 buckets to determine the state's disadvantaged communities. That's not finalized yet. It will be by the end of the year, but that's sort of a huge focus for my work now, and as Peggy said, place matters, and the consequences of this very technical and wonky decision I think will be felt around the state, and there's a lot of more work left to do. Happy to talk about that further, but that's sort of a quick overview of what my role is in the state.
Wonderful, thank you. Emily, turning to you, I'd love to have you introduce yourself and your work to the group further, but also talk about some of the opportunities that are upcoming. How can people get more involved in this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Dan. Do I need a mic or can you
all?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Dan, and thank you all for welcoming me here and for organizing this tremendous conversation. It's wonderful to be here for Harlem Week. So I'm Emily Maxwell, and I'm the director of the city's program at the Nature Conservancy in New York. And for those of you who don't know, the Nature Conservancy is a global conservation organization. We work in about 76 countries, both directly and through partnerships. And I'll be honest, my own background, academic training, and sort of lived experience was growing up in a city and having a sort of experiencing the legacies of segregation, of disinvestment, of sort of the destruction of our neighborhoods. And I didn't ever picture myself at an organization like the Nature Conservancy. I always worked at very grassroots organizations. And the Nature Conservancy has, in the past 10 years, embraced a practice in cities. And so I work in that practice, and it's an evolving practice. A lot of what we do is produce really great scientific information and help translate that into policy. And I'll give a couple of examples that are opportunity-based. One of those is that if we look at how environmental assets are distributed, unsurprisingly, it's the inverse of environmental harms. So we see that environmental harms correlate strongly to neighborhoods that have more people of color and more low-income people. We also see that those same neighborhoods have less environmental assets. They have less tree canopy, they have less green roofs, they have less open space. And so we understand that in order to actually address these issues, it can't just be, hey, we need more of everything everywhere. We actually need race-conscious policy, and this is a tremendously important part of the path forward. So to that end, we worked hard when thinking about how to prioritize green roof investments and tax abatements to make sure that the most heat vulnerable communities were prioritized for those investments, including race, which is a critical part of heat vulnerability. But also now we're working on the urban forest, which is a more distributed system. And New York City has about 22% canopy cover on average. Here in Harlem, the greater Harlem community, we actually have just under 22%, but it's very heterogeneous. So you have some areas with far less even within Harlem. And so the question then becomes, how do we distribute that better? So working with about 50 other organizations, too many to name here, we crafted the Urban Forest Agenda, which is a document that really sets a vision for the urban forest for New York City. And we aspire for the city on average to have 30% canopy by 2035. And why 30%? So our own Department of Health has indicated that in order to actually achieve cooling thresholds, we need to have at least 32% vegetation. And so tree canopy becomes tremendously important. But we can only do that if we invest in those communities that need it most, especially the most heat vulnerable communities and other vulnerable communities. The last piece I'll mention, and you can see I'm a bit passionate, so I can go on, but I'll wait for other questions, is we're also working hard with many of you in this room, including We Act, to advance the Bond Act that your good senator mentioned. And that Bond Act, it will be voted on November 8th, and it's a $4.2 billion bond act for clean air, clean water, and green jobs. And there are over 200 organizations statewide pushing this. If it passes, it will create $8.7 billion in investment in capital projects. And importantly, 35 to 40% of that, much like the Climate Act, is required to be invested in the term disadvantaged communities. And so we're here to sort of share information about that and hope that you all will turn out and vote for that. So it's great to be here with you.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And our last panelist that I would love to introduce, and have him introduce himself, of course, Judge Tingling. Your work with West Harlem Development Corporation is lived experience of what's happening in communities of color across the country. How are you reacting to this moment and to this information?
All right. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me. What a prestigious panel. So please excuse me. I tend to be direct and rather blunt. And so when I was asked to appear here last week, I was very honored, and I spent the entire week wondering why. I am not an expert, and I am in awe of the people that are sitting on this panel. But as the week progressed, and when I got here tonight, and based on everything that I've heard, I know exactly why I'm here tonight. Because I am the person that has lived through all of these concerns and issues and the work. I'm sorry, Peggy, I just have to call you out. 1987, I was a young attorney, and I remember you and Chuck Sutton at West Harlem Democrats, and I remember when you started this work. But I also remember, question, how many people in this room know the story of why the water sewage treatment plant is on 138th Street and Riverside Drive? Just raise your hand. Okay. And so quickly, I will share it with you. Because one of the things that I've realized in being here tonight, and I've heard it from every panel member, and I've heard it from Peggy, and I heard it from Senator Cleary, racism, systemic bias and racism is at the core of what you are dealing with, what the community is facing, and what the fight is all about. So the story of the water treatment plant. That treatment plant was supposed to be built down on the lower west side, 65th, 72nd, 79th. But the residents of that community said, oh, hell no. You're not going to build that here. We have trees, we have park, we have all of those things, and it will not happen. And guess what? Didn't happen. And then they moved it uptown. And I remember going to building meetings, community meetings, where the city would send out representatives to convince the community it was all great, it was all safe. You used to turn on your faucet, brown water would come out, and there would be city representatives there, and the building, the residents of the community would say, it's clean, go ahead and drink it. Nobody would drink it. And that plant went up. And the only thing that was taken out of it was that they came to a decision to build a park on top of it. How many of you go down the West Side Highway on a hot day? Kind of funky. Okay, very, very, very funky. But I'm just using that as one of the examples. So I'm so honored to be here tonight, and I will be speaking about, because I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life. I am an almost always lived here New Yorker, okay? I was born in the Dominican Republic, which for those of us who live uptown also know as the baby's hospital at Columbia Presbyterian. It's in Washington Heights for you people that don't. And after I was born, a year later, I spent 5 years in South Carolina at my grandmother's house. And we lived about 75 yards from the railroad tracks. And I remember the smoke. I remember all of those things. But you were children. You didn't know. You didn't know why you were there. You didn't know all of that. When I was a kid, came back to New York, the Hudson River smelled like boiled eggs. It stunk. You couldn't use the parks. Everything was concrete. And I watched all of this. Now I'm a grandfather, and I have grandchildren. And I watched the buses, and I realized the work that Peggy did, and those like her, to get that change. Because when I was a kid, running after buses and smelling the fumes was a game. 20 years, 40 years, 2 generations, I won't be here. And so the work that is going to be done by the people in this room is going to affect my children and my grandchildren. And I'm pleased to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and what a great panel to be able to share the stage with. The theme came up early, and I believe I heard this from Peggy, was like education and organizing are what's critical to really solving this crisis, and policy landscape moving in fits and starts, sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back, sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, like a complicated situation that we're in. I'm interested in hearing the thoughts from this group on really, are we moving in the right direction? Are things, is the policy landscape progressing towards being able to deliver better environmental justice? And are the opportunities in front of us, planting more street trees, billions of dollars that could come through the State Bond Act, are we moving in the right direction? I would love to hear the audience, the panel here address that. And maybe Courtney, starting with you.
Thank you. So I'm so excited to hear about this 30 to 40%, right, being allocated to disadvantaged communities. And I hear us switching between this language of race-conscious policies and disadvantaged. And we have to get on the same page in the terms of the framing of who are we speaking about? And you're talking about this, right? To what communities are we talking about, and having this race-conscious focus? And part of why I think naming racism is so critical is because the underlying sentiment is that Harlem is not as important. Black people are not as valuable. And we talked about being blunt, let's be blunt, right? That's what that means. When we decide to put dump pollutants here is because we don't think the people who live here are as important. That same sentiment is going to come into play when we're thinking about policy and policy implementation. So I would love for us to think about as a group, what is going to derail the allocation of that 30 to 40% to disadvantaged communities? What political finagling is going to happen to try and keep that from being the case? Because that's what I would anticipate would happen. So there's education, there's organizing, and then there's strategy, anticipating racism, and strategy anticipating anti-blackness in particular. People who don't think you're important or valuable don't want to give you money and will try to do whatever they can to try and steer money in other directions, even if the commitment is explicitly to do something different. And we see that over and over with environmental justice efforts. We see it over and over in indigenous communities where they say, yes, we'll give you the land and you can build your own community, but not just you, we need to put a public park, and not just, so it starts to get changed. So I want us to think about, I'm interested in what you all have to say, what can we anticipate now about how that funding might get derailed?
I think she may be asking you a question, Adriana. Yeah.
I would love to follow up on that. Just to summarize the response to your question, Dan, I would say yes, and there is so much more we can and should and must be doing on environmental justice. I think listening to Peggy talk about 30 years of work and an advancement that she has helped to lead for Harlem, and that has impacts across the entire nation. And the role that I'm in right now did not exist 7 months ago. Yeah. The role that I was in before that, as the first senior advisor for environmental justice for the city of New York, working with Dan, did not exist before Peggy fought for 10 years to pass a law in the city that created that role, that created an environmental justice program in New York City. So that is accomplishment. And the 35 to 40% threshold that you spoke of there, that happened because there were years of organizing that happened that put that in the law. And so the work of folks in community-based organizations, organizers, grassroots organizers like those at We Act and others, have helped to create momentum, so much momentum that the President of the United States talks about environmental justice and names that as a priority. So that is advancement, and should not be discounted by any means. And that is not to say that there aren't obstacles ahead of us and a lot of work that still needs to be done. I think education is a huge part of that. Having gone through this 130-day comment period, I think it's important for me to explain that 35 to 40% is a floor, not a ceiling, first of all, and and this is not sort of a environmental racism Hunger Games where if you're not a quote-unquote disadvantaged community, you will not receive any climate investments from the state of New York. First of all, there's still another 65%. And second of all, the fact that this exists is because of systemic and institutional racism that has existed for so many years that made it so that we needed to put it into law and mandate that communities that have been disproportionately overburdened must see the benefits. If we were doing so great at doing that already, we wouldn't need to set that floor. So I would say that that's the important context to bring here. What I am really interested in is once I can once we finally have these final criteria is how does that money become operationalized? How does it actually impact people? The end result of money being spent in communities like Harlem is a good thing, but who spends that money is an important part of that too. And I'm really interested in exploring with community partners and local businesses and advocates how that money is unlocked in a way that's more than just to be blunt, like the patriarchal way of just like the state handing out money and some well-moneyed corporation has the ability to set up a fund to take advantage of that money, and then they spend it putting some great, amazing clean energy technology here in Harlem, but they don't hire anyone from Harlem. They're not a Harlem-owned business. And then they say, okay, thank you, congratulations on your solar panels, and that's it. That's an obstacle that I'm really interested in unlocking, and I think the We Act gave us a great example in the Solar Uptown Now model, in sort of unlocking the potential for making sure that funds are prioritized. Women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, and local hiring and labor standards, and all the things that's going to actually move the needle socioeconomically, in addition to the environment. And then I also, wanted to clarify that the Climate Act did not create a standalone or new fund for disadvantaged communities or for any communities. It's a law, not a budget item, right? So there's a broad portfolio across the state. At my agency, at NYSERDA, the Energy Research and Development Authority of the state, that has programs sometimes economy-wide, sometimes statewide, and so the actual dollars flowing and investments made will vary agency by agency, program by program. And so I think all state entities, though, have to meet this mandate, this floor. And so I expect that there will be changes to program eligibility, the types of programs, the level of investment to make sure they're meeting that. But the devil is always in the details for those. And so that's, I think, another one that I would point out there.
One quick follow-up on that, John, because you mentioned before enhanced public participation, I think was your term. How do you see the broader public and communities continuing to get involved in that effort to not only hold government accountable, but to continue to shape the needs for what their communities ultimately will receive out of this?
That's a really important question. I think the one main, I guess, vehicle for that was, in defining what the disadvantaged communities are. That process. There was a sort of public comment period. I did a roadshow across the state, and we had 12 public hearings across the state, including a couple here in the city. So that's one aspect of it. And the Climate Act really sort of carved out the Climate Justice Working Group as sort of being this body it's made up of environmental justice organizations from across the state. We Act is a member of that body, and as the working group is really seen as a liaison between environmental justice communities and the state as they're developing these policies. But I think that there should be more than that, and it really comes into, as I said, program by program, agency by agency, making sure that there are these public participation practices baked into how they do their work. And if they're designing a new heat pump program, and that heat pump program 35% has to be in disadvantaged communities, who is designing it? Are there public comment periods? Are there hearings about it? I think that is a huge part, needs to be a huge part of this.
Great, thank you. Emily, I feel like you were holding back a little bit on some more important information on how, maybe that's very related to this, of how communities can help drive this outcome. You've talked about trees. There's the Urban Forestry campaign pushing on the city to invest to deal with heat hotspots, the State Bond Act. Give us a little bit more on what people can do soon on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can also explore the question that Dr. Cogburn was asking more, because I think they're interrelated. So Forest for All NYC is a 60-plus member coalition, 60 organizational member coalition that's really working to protect, enhance, expand, and sustain the New York City urban forest, and to do so in a way that really advances justice, equity, resiliency, and sustainability. And we are excited that in our first year of activity, we've actually gotten a fair amount of interest. And one thing I am excited about in terms of progress is I think that it's really tremendous to see the turnover that we've had in New York City Council has brought us a lot of new, fresh energy that looks more like the city that we live in. And a lot of those council members are really enthusiastic about some of these issues, and they have fresh energy. And so I always think, like, when you have fresh energy, that's when I want to, like, sit down with you and be like, okay, let's talk. There's stuff we can do. And we've seen that council member Shaker Krishnan, who's from Jackson Heights and leads the Parks and Recreation Committee, has already committed to the 30% canopy by 2035 goal equitably, and he has a real interest in racial justice. He's going to need our support and our outcry in some ways to help move that legislation if he does move it forward. We've seen all 5 borough presidents, including your own, Mark Levine, come out and say it's time for 1 million more trees, and he's committed, in words at least, to equity and justice and to that canopy goal of 30 by 35. He really led that charge, and the other 4 borough presidents are doing that. So I think we have an opportunity. Part of my answer to Dr. Cogburn's question is we have to pay attention, right? So this issue of, like, once you pass a law or once somebody makes a statement, then it's time to monitor, bird dog, hold them accountable, help them, right? Do all of the things that we need in order to do that. So I hope that those of you who are with organizations might consider joining Forest for All NYC and helping with that cause. And also, if you hear about legislation related to the urban forest, please support it. We want to see more trees in more communities, and especially those communities that have lower canopy cover and more vulnerabilities. And then, of course, you know, for those of you who are voters, on November 8th, you will have an opportunity, and I'm going to do this, to turn over the ballot, because I have been advised that this thing is going to be on the back of the ballot and harder to find, and decide if you want to vote for the Bond Act, to really create that funding pot, because as Adriana noted, the CLCPA, the Climate Act, is not a budget item, and the state is going to need funding to bring this vision to fruition. So I would encourage you, if you're a voter, consider voting for it, tell your friends about it, make sure you turn over the ballot and actually see it. That's, I think, one of the harder things.
But do you have, Judge?
Oh, yes.
So, sorry, I thought you were about to say something.
No, I did want to say something.
please
Emily,
do.
when you finish?
I am set.
Okay, so you asked a question, and I would offer 3 things. Number 1, education. Number 2, action. And number 3, money. Okay, that's the reality of getting this done. Now, we've heard tonight about so much history. We've heard tonight about so much action. I'll be real with you. Many people in disadvantaged communities are not educated as to the environmental injustice that they suffer, because it's just another day. It is just another day. And money. I would offer this to this group. It hasn't passed the House yet, but we just had the inaptly named Inflation Reduction Act. And Emily, to your point, that is money, okay? And so we've heard tonight about bias, we've heard about systemic racism, and I look at it as that is origination. And I offer to everybody that there needs to be a focus now on the manifestation. In other words, what is going to happen to those funds that will become available? Will they come to this community, and how will they be used? Small example, I've done a small dive into the package. One of the things are tax credits for the purchase of electric vehicles. But will there be electric charging stations in our communities? Are you going to have to drive to Jersey or Yonkers or Far Rockaway to get it done? Those are the manifestations of moving the needle forward, the work that's been done. And those are the things that we have to be so aware of, and at the same time, educate our communities. Every single thing that has been said here tonight is important, whether it's culling statistics, analyzing them, promoting them, publicizing them. Every single thing is important. The advocacy. I was going to make a suggestion, Emily, whenever you have a bond act, always make sure that it's in the same year as a presidential election, because people come out to vote. And other times they don't come out to vote and they don't turn the paper over. That's the reality. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm hoping that there are some questions for this great group out in the audience. I know that we're going to run out of time soon, so I want to at least have some opportunity. But I think, Arthur, yep, great. I'll moderate it from up here. So I saw at least one hand go up already. So would be happy to, yes, please. Although, do we have a microphone? Do we need a microphone?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Tony.
I have a question for Maxwell. Tony Rogers, Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce. Tony Rogers, Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce and Harlem Week. It's my understanding that male trees give off more pollen than female trees. I also understand that during the Bloomberg administration, many of the trees that were planted in urban areas were male trees, which create more pollen, which creates more asthma, which creates more issues with allergies. How can we be assured that with the movement to create more tree growth in our urban areas that the correct trees are planted? And what do we do with the ones that are still giving off a lot of pollen?
Tony, so you asked me this question on the radio, and Emily is the expert's name who I gave you on that radio show.
Right, and you told me what to do.
But I didn't give her a heads up this was coming. So.
No, I mean, I love this question, and I will say, as much as a tree lover as I am, there is no perfect solution. And so you're absolutely right. Selecting the right tree for the right location is key. And I think the city knows a lot more than they used to about sort of what is the right species for the right location. I think that they've gotten a lot smarter. But yes, if you suffer from allergies or asthma, there are some trees that can trigger that. And so there's a few things. As we plant more trees, our tree palette is much bigger. We need to pick the right trees. But this is where that monitoring and accountability comes in. And I want to tie it back to one of the potential challenges of money and one of the potential solutions. So if there's a lot of money, but we don't have a workforce that represents our communities, that's ready to get out there and actually build these things for our own communities, we're in trouble, right? Then where is the money going to go? And so one of the things that we've been doing in partnership with an organization called Green City Force that does workforce development for young people, and New York City Housing Authority, and also US Forest Service and New York City Parks, it's a big partnership, is we've been doing a tree inventory on NYCHA campuses. And the reason for that is that NYCHA accounts for about 1.15% of New York City's land, but actually has more than 2% of our tree canopy. So they're playing an outsized role, and it's often some of the limited green space in some of our most heat vulnerable neighborhoods. And yet there's also a tremendous opportunity for more canopy. Even here in Harlem, NYCHA campuses present an opportunity for expansion. But what we find is because people didn't always make the right decisions about what tree to plant, I mean, this is just reality, like we learn as we go. NYCHA's tree canopy is like, it's a majority of one tree kind and age class. So it's like a lot of old sycamores, you know, with the camouflage bark. And so what's scary about that is when you have something that is like a homogeneous age class, you can see a lot of loss all at once. So we need to upgrade that palette. We need to expand it. But to me, what's most important is we can't, back to Adriana's point, just go in there, plant the trees and out. It matters more that we're working with young people who live in NYCHA to give them forestry skills, to give them those management skills so that they can determine what is needed in their own communities and influence that. So it's a long answer to your question. There's the scientific question of, yes, we can select better trees, but there's the bigger question of how do we socialize that and support people to have good jobs and then really lead in community planning and self-determination.
And there's probably a really important point here too, to take it slightly away from trees, that while trees are an asthma trigger, pollution, burning natural gas in your stove, like other bigger, maybe bigger, I don't actually know the answer to that question, asthma triggers that also need to be dealt with to get at those harms as well. And so the things we heard about, the program to swap out gas stoves for induction stoves, the work to shut down peaker plants, stop burning fossil fuels wherever we can, like all of those also have an outsized impact on asthma triggers as well.
I would add roaches and mice and mold inside your home are asthma triggers that can harm your health as well.
Maybe a plug for the Healthy Homes Act, right?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yes. Thank you for pointing me in the other direction. Yes, please.
Hi everyone. Oh my God, that's so loud. My name is Hannah. I am actually about to graduate from the Columbia Climate School. And so the way that the program is structured is mostly scientific core classes, but I supplemented my classes with like environmental justice classes and human rights in the Anthropocene. And so this is really everything I'm passionate about. So thank you for coming out. And I actually have a kind of a roundabout question. So I tend to view environmental racism as like historical actions impacting people presently. And I tend to view environmental justice as what's happening like presently and how that could change for the future. And so my question is, how do you balance like righting the historical wrongs while also paving the way for a more equitable and accessible future for everybody moving forward? If that makes sense.
That's a great question. Who wants to take that?
I'll start. So I think that's something that's still happening. I think there are policies, like environmental justice policies, some of the early ones that like the Office of Environmental Justice in my agency works on, for example, are meant to stop the lack of fair treatment, lack of meaningful involvement that created the sort of the sacrifice zones and the disproportionate burdened communities that we have now. And so to your point, that's forward looking. I think that there's the consciousness of looking deeper than that and trying to redress the past harms is actually, I would say, newer. And I think one way, at least in New York State and within the Climate Act that is articulated is within the sort of statutory purposes of the disadvantaged communities criteria. Sorry, I keep going back to the same thing. But beyond the 35-40% thing, there are a couple of other things that have to happen in disadvantaged communities. The state has to prioritize emissions reductions and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities. We have to consider the impacts to disadvantaged communities in our regulatory impact statements. Specifically, the language in the law says that no activities or permitting decisions can disproportionately impact disadvantaged communities. And so my agency is working on, to operationalize that. It's ongoing right now, but that requires us to look a lot, I would say a lot deeper than just changing how we're behaving and looking forward, because now we have, we have a draft version, but we have 45 different indicators that show what the disadvantages are in the state. And so moving forward, as we think about where is this wastewater treatment facility going to go, or other facilities, we have the state now has to or the highway or whatever it happens to be, the state now has to ask themselves, will putting this here disproportionately impact the disadvantaged community? And I think that, coupled with the fact that we have to reduce emissions and co-pollutants, is going to, I think, redress the systemic issues within the communities. That's my hope, at least. Hopefully that starts to answer your question, but others can chime in if they want.
There's a question. I'll say this very quickly. Oh, I'm sorry. You have a question, Joe? I'll say this very quickly. I believe your question was, how do you balance the historical racism with moving forward? My answer is, you can't. You simply can't. You cannot go back and try and equalize the historical systemic racism and bias. the only thing, my estimation, that you can do is to do what the people here are doing, and that is moving forward. You don't add on to it. You get to a point, you say, that's it, that's enough. You don't build another bus depot. You don't build another fossil fuel burning plant. You don't do those things. If you want to move to a more sustainable energy consumption and usage, you start building those things now in the communities. And as far as advocacy, to my deputy commissioner, the definition of disproportionately impacted communities is going to direct and control so much of what will be possible. So you have to advocate for what that definition is going to be.
And I'll just add one, sorry, mics in every direction. We're not going to double mic this, thank you. I'll add one more piece, which I think is really complicated and which hasn't come up, which is if we don't do this work in solidarity across not just the environmental sector, but with others too, we run the risk of perpetuating harms by causing displacement. And I think that this is a really complicated issue, but one that we need to be paying attention to. So if you're somebody who's entering this field anew, and congratulations on graduating, like that's amazing. I am keenly aware that trees and green infrastructure, one of the benefits that we laud them for is that they can increase property values. Well, what does increased property value mean when it comes to potential for community displacement? And I'm not going to strive to answer that, but what I am going to say is, in the spirit of moving forward, as we move forward, we need to make sure we're not inadvertently or intentionally sort of moving people away as we improve landscapes. The human dimension and the landscape dimension has to be put together.
Great, thanks, Lloyd. So I saw two hands here. Maybe a microphone.
Thank you for like your.
So we'll come back to you. We'll come back to you.
Sorry, I didn't see the other person. Thank you for like your comment. Yeah, sorry. Thank you for your comments on housing. That was my question. I guess for you. I know that specifically like the act, it's about like the environment, but like I live in Harlem. I've grew up in Harlem my entire life, and like I came back after moving away for 3 years, and Harlem looks very, very different than like it did 3 years ago. Obviously, it's the pandemic, COVID, and all the things. But what does it look like for Harlem to stay like what Harlem looks like now in some ways in terms of people, like the people of color in Harlem, enjoying the benefits of like the benefits that are coming, like this percentage that you mentioned that's allocated for, sorry, I'm kind of nervous when I speak in front of people, that's being allocated to communities of color. However, the term is going to be defined. And why I thought of that question was because the professor brought up the point of how are you strategizing for like anti-blackness and how are you strategizing for racism. And I feel like that's one of the things. It's like people will enjoy the benefits of these things, but it might not be the people who have suffered in this specific neighborhood. And I don't know like what that looks like in terms of policy, like thinking of housing justice and environmental justice, and like whether those investments would also address some of that.
Yeah, that's a really important question, a really tough one to answer, I would say. I think one of the main things is to keep things community-driven and to keep decision-making as community-empowered as possible, and making sure that those who are part of the community, historically a part of the community, are involved meaningfully in decision making. It's a core tenet of environmental justice. But as far as getting into the specifics of how to protect against that type of displacement, that requires people with expertise in housing justice and economists and lots of other people than just folks who sit in the environmental justice space, or just myself. And so I think it's something that a lot of folks are grappling with. I wish that I had a more robust answer, but I think in general, I think that the more that we can ensure that community members are empowered, the better. I also want to say that I know how palpable the fear of displacement can be, and of not being able to stay where you are if your landlord at all decides to raise your rent on you, and that is real. I don't think that that fear should mean that communities, disadvantaged or disproportionately burdened communities, don't get to grow or don't get to see nice things. And so I would respectfully and politely push back on that a little to say that Harlem does deserve more trees. I would say Harlem probably deserves better transit service as well, and lots of other great things. And got it. Sorry to mischaracterize your statement. I wasn't intending to mischaracterize it. I'm just saying that, like, I think it has to be sort of a yes and mentality. It is really important as these changes are happening. Thanks.
Thanks, Adriana. Can we get a mic over in the blue? Yeah.
All right. Good evening. My name is Rosalind Quay, and I'm here wearing multiple identities. I'm a Harlem resident at the Riverton, and I'm also a power and utilities professional. And at the beginning, our moderator mentioned verticals, and I'm noticing that industry is not present on the panel. And so I'm wondering, and this is not the only forum in which that's been the case. So I'm just wondering what it will take to start to bring in industry more, because there are people like me who are working inside who need to we're engaging in advocacy within our companies and want to shift the paradigm, but we also need to be invited to have these conversations. So what needs to happen in order to give us a seat at the table, so to speak?
So I can take a crack in part. So one of the things about the Forest for All NYC coalition that we are a part of is that we do include industry. Now, the issue is which industries are interested in the urban forest. And so I think as an industry representative, something you can also do is to build connections into the issues that interest you. And actually the industry that we have in the Forest for All NYC coalition, it's a really interesting burgeoning industry. It's the wood waste reclamation industry. Because one of the questions was, what do we do with a tree that we don't want anymore? Or what do we do with a tree that might die and we have to salvage? Well, that could just decompose and become more carbon in the atmosphere, or we can reuse it and make it a value-added product. So I sort of think that with industry, the first line is to integrate along common interests, right? To actually, just like any solidarity move, to say, why do we have a shared interest? Why do we have a shared interdependence here? So I would really encourage you to think about that and then kind of join into those causes where it actually, there is that Venn diagram, that shared interest and common interest. But you're more than welcome to join Forest for All NYC. I have to make the plug. And I'll also say on our green roofs advocacy, we do work with green roofs installers. Right now, that's a hyper boutique industry. And until that becomes like a mainstream roofers industry, we are not going to get as far as fast as we need to go. But we will work with industry when there's common cause. So that's what I think we need in order to collaborate.
Thank you. I think this is our last question, but you have a microphone?
Charles.
Oh,
You did? Okay.
yeah. Yes.
Real quick. So I was following what Judge Tingling was really saying. I'm a little troubled by the word disadvantage. have had our experiences with MWBE, for example, and we saw how that's been manipulated and distorted to our disadvantage. Never the disadvantage. So I'm hoping that we can dig deeper into that advocacy. The second thing that I just wanted to say, I want to be the first to say, I see the Columbia Climate School, I want the Peggy Shepard Climate School. Because as Milton Tingling said, we've been working with Peggy for 30, Lloyd, I, and others, working with Peggy for 30, 40 years. I need to see the next generation of Peggy. And that's what to come from that. So disadvantage, and let Peggy have her school.
Adrian, do you want to take that point around the terminology and how that's been defined and set in language and set in law?
Sure.
So I'm going to ask Arthur if he would give us closing remarks, but I would like to just give thanks to our panelists for their insight and vision. And sometimes the simplest answers are the answers. How do we get industry to the table? Invite them. Sometimes it's not as complicated as it might appear. Yes, that doesn't mean they're going to run to the table. They're certainly not coming if you don't invite them. And if they come, because it's in their best interest. So I think you've given Dan and I a charge that in concert with Peggy, we will have additional sessions and we will have industry at the table. And I wanted to say something because sometimes we're just not straight up with each other, okay? Because we look at each other through a prism of race and the classism, etc. What is Charles Powell addressing when we say WMBE? Well, there was an MBE program. And that MBE program was fought for over decades and about getting opportunities for minority business enterprises. Okay? Minority business enterprises. And so it was dealt with in terms of what can we do for the minorities. That was fought aggressively across the nation, but successful in a number of places. But then what happened? They started pitting us against each other, as they do. And they got the way through the most conservative of political structures to put the initial W there. Now, WMBE, well, what did that mean? So when the men started questioning the W, it pit the women against the men, okay? And the thought was, well, they don't want to have women. What's the problem with that? The problem with the W is the majority of America is women. And the majority of America is white women. So what happened? Okay? The same white gentleman who had businesses who did not relate to people of color, would not hire people of color, would not deal with people of color, they put the W on it. Right. And so now they then started getting contracts because they put their sisters and their wives and their daughters out there. Are you following what I'm telling you? Okay, so I want us to talk, because when we talk about it, it's like it's black versus white. No, this is what happened. The majority of America is white women. No, that's fact. So as soon as you take something that was earmarked for the minority, and now you open it up for the majority, the same contractors, the same businesses, all they did was set up some side shelves with their daughters, with their wives, etc. And now, if anyone in this room can challenge this, I'd appreciate it. Let's look where the vast, vast, vast majority of dollars that were supposedly earmarked for the minority business community goes now. I know the numbers, and the numbers is about 64% of the money go to businesses that are managed and controlled by white women. So this is not a white-black thing. This is what's going on. And so we need to look at that. We need to understand what this is about. And the only way we do it is having honest conversation with each other. It's not pointing fingers. It's not saying black versus white. It is what's going on. Okay? Marvin Gaye. What's going on? And if we look at what's going on in front of us, we'll understand what is taking place. And then we will communicate it. And we will find a way to make this happen. But it only comes from communication. So I close before I bring Arthur up. And I've learned, Marco, as you know, to just keep saying this. Just keep saying this. Just keep saying this. I've learned if you just put things out there, people will pick it up. And so, Michael, there was, and Greg, you know, you've heard me say this. One of the most important persons in my life and in this city was Percy used to be the president of the borough of Manhattan, Honorable Percy Sutton. And Percy Sutton taught me this. So I want you to follow it. I was asking him, Mr. Sutton, what is happening with this divide and how come we can't connect, etc. And I'm going to repeat this often. He said, Lloyd, the foundation is the word common. Okay? He said, if we know what we have in common, everybody in this room has something in common. We're in this room together right now. We all have that in common. So he said, if you figure out what you have in common, you will become communal. So now we're becoming communal because we know we have a common cause. And if you become communal, you will communicate. Okay? And if you communicate, you will have a community. And so the foundation of those four words are common. Common, communal, communicate, community. And I argue that if we walk out of this room and we don't see ourselves as a community dealing with this common issue, then we've missed the whole point of this evening. And I know you didn't come out to miss the point. And so by closing, let me just mention, and I'm going to ask Arthur if he would share, take information when you're leaving on Harlem Week. Just understand that this anti-gun violence is another part of climate change, okay? That's right. Same people, same deal, and same victims, okay? And that we need to come out and we need to walk together. We don't need to agree on everything, but we need to communicate, and that's how we get together. Without further ado, I ask Arthur Chien to please come and give us some closing remarks. We so much appreciate you being with us for this entire program.
I don't know how you close after a closer, so I really won't. I think we're going to let the Marvin Gaye citations stay as the open and close for this. I will say this, there are two parties, it's a two-party system in this country, right? And one party coalesces very easily, and the other one does not. because there are so many issues. People can break up climate crisis from gun violence and women's rights and stand, they feel, along their flag. But what I would say is, from my point of view, there's a lot more in common with these causes than differences, and for there to be balance in this country, right? Not even to get ahead at this point, just to have balance, we have to take a gut check and say, all right, which team am I going to fight with? Because if I'm going to be grumpy about other parts of something and not show up to vote, who loses? All for those causes that I just mentioned, all three. And I would also end with a point of optimism. I know it's not our news thing usually, but if you take a look around this room, whether it's men, women, different backgrounds, different ages, different generations, different contributions, like everybody is in here and sat through all of this, right? So I would argue that this should give Lloyd a lot of reason to be optimistic, but I also know him to be a man of results, so he's going to want to see some proof. Please, if there are any questions, whoever can stay, they're going to stay. Stay in touch with them. The question that you raised, how do you get a seat at the table? Sometimes you got to ask for it, right? They're not going to come and say, who wants one? It's got to be a demand. So you have great minds to access here with great, powerful people who have track records, and I would urge all of us to use them. All right? Thanks so much for coming, guys.